All right, let's pick up from where we last concluded, having to do with some of the reasons for variant readings in the Greek New Testament. The last session had to do with unintentional changes. This presentation has to do with some intentional changes. Now, perhaps a scribe corrects an error that was in his original text, and that has to do with spelling or perhaps grammar. Sometimes scribes would try and harmonize some of the discordant parallels, maybe something that they knew by heart. Or they would add in some clarifying material. For example, in Luke 5:32, I did not come to call the righteous, but the sinners. Now, perhaps a later scribe comes along and says, I want to clarify this statement here by saying that the sinners here also need to be called to repentance. So you have a change like that is added. Some of the other changes, for example, there may be the clearing up of some historical or geographical difficulties. For example, the length of time during the crucifixion. Was it 3 hours or was it 6 hours? And there are some variant readings on this. Sometimes scribes were motivated by doctrinal issues. For example, from Luke 23, and also other criminals too were led away with him to be crucified. Now, in some of the manuscripts, a shift occurs to correct the notion that Jesus was the criminal along with the other two. And then you'll see down below in 1 Thessalonians 3:2, Paul makes some statements here about Timothy. Now, you'll see here 5 variant readings. God's fellow worker, God's servant and God's fellow worker, and God's servant and our fellow worker. Now, it may well be the case that God's fellow worker, and I would argue that this is the more original, was the closest. And then later some scribes would have difficulty in saying that Timothy could be placed on a horizontal level with God as God's fellow worker. So notice number 2, fellow worker. God is taken out of the picture here. Or change the word from fellow worker to servant. Or number 4, Timothy is a servant and God's fellow worker. And finally, God's servant and our fellow worker. So it may well be that scribes here saw something that could potentially be offensive, and they made the changes, and you'll see here 5 variant readings. And in subsequent blogs, we'll talk a little bit about some of the principles by which text critics operate. Thanks.